Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Steinhauer, Director of the Institute of Politics Speaker Series. We are pleased to welcome you today to a discussion with New York Times reporters Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests in a few minutes, I want to just mention a couple of upcoming events we have at IOP and go over a few housekeeping rules. On Friday, May 13th, a group of physicians will lead a conversation in the IOP living room on maternal health disparities in Chicago during an event hosted by Chicago Style. On Monday, May 16th, the International Policy Program will host a conversation with former First Secretary, Deputy Secretary General to the UN, Louise Frechette, at the IOP House about the evolution of the United Nations. And on Monday evening, May 16th, Dr. Ngozi Ezike and Dr. Thomas Fisher will join us to discuss how health officials and providers can rebuild trust in an era of stark polarization. And that event will take place here at the Quad Club. After tonight's moderated discussion, we will open the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up to ask your questions at the microphone. As usual, we give priority for the first questions to be asked by our students. And as a housekeeping note, please make sure your cell phones now are on silent. We will now hear formal introductions from Caitlin Van Balen, a fourth-year student at the college majoring in public policy. Caitlin is currently the managing editor for The Gate, the undergraduate political review here at the Institute of Politics. Please join me in welcoming Caitlin to the podium.
Hi there. Welcome to the latest IOP Speaker Series event, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future. My name is Caitlin Van Balen. I'm a fourth-year student from New Jersey studying public policy and the managing editor of The Gate, the IOP's undergraduate political magazine. We're thrilled to be joined today by two national political correspondents for the New York Times, Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns, whose new book, This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future, covers how the stability of American politics has been racked by 2 years of perpetual crisis. Before joining the Times, Mr. Martin was a senior political writer for Politico and a writer for The Hotline and The National Review. He also co-authored a best-selling book on the 2012 election and frequently appears as a political analyst on television and radio. Mr. Burns, before beginning his work at the Times covering the 2016 election, was a reporter and editor at Politico, where he covered the 2012 election and previously was the editor of the Harvard Political Review. Their conversation today will be moderated by David Axelrod, former senior advisor to President Barack Obama and now director of the Institute of Politics here at UChicago. Now, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Harvard, that's in the east, right?
It's just near Boston.
Good to see you guys.
Thanks, Max.
I want to, as I read this book, I read a lot about the book before we saw the book because you guys were very skillful at disseminating some nuggets there that would be enticing to people. Well, let me ask you about that first. I mean, my fundamental point is this book is so much bigger than the things that we read that were kind of exclusive sort of scoops. The narrative of what's going on in our country and what went on in 2020 and I guess into this year was really, really deep and wonderfully written. But how much pressure are you under when you write a book like this to produce things that nobody else has, scoops that will, I see you rolling your eyes.
No, I'm not. I mean, I think
I'm talking about Alex.
Oh.
I think he's rolling his eyes at you.
Well, first off, let me just say thank you to the University of Chicago, to the IOP, to our friend and former colleague Jennifer Steinhauer, and to David for hosting us here. It's a thrill to be back in Hyde Park. There's certainly pressure from the publisher of your book that obviously is paying you to produce a work that they want to see people purchase themselves.
By the way, it's available out there. So,
and on the way out, we'd love for you to grab a copy. We sign them all. But I think with Alex and I, we've been colleagues now for nearly 15 years. There's just the pressure that we felt was just from ourselves. Like, we're competitors. We wanted to produce the best possible book. And that means like two things, like a well-written, well-crafted narrative, and it means a lot of reporting. And so we were committed to getting those scoops, David, and driving news and getting inside the rooms of American politics, getting those conversations. Not necessarily because we felt pressure from any external forces, but because we wanted to. And we felt that this is an extremely important period of American history. And we wanted to offer what we hope will be the building blocks for future historians who look back on these tumultuous years and try to capture what was going on in American politics and why did it happen. And so that's why we were so committed to capturing not just secondhand accounts, but getting firsthand accounts, getting primary source material, whether it's the audio recordings that hopefully you've heard, or whether it was memos or documents that brought people to this period, and it could stand the test of time.
And not just in Washington, but what's so interesting about your book is you have players across the country who interacted with the politics of the moment, and including our own mayor here, Lori Lightfoot, is represented in this book. But Alex, and I don't want to be parochial about the book writing business, there are a ton of books out already and some coming about the 2020 election. You guys got a book contract. You knew that. You knew Woodward and Costo are out there, and Maggie Haberman, whose book is yet to come, and all the other books that are being written. How did you decide what the contours of this book would be, and what did you hope the story would be?
Well, first of all, let me just say my own thanks to you, to the IOP, to Jennifer, to Caitlin, and to all of you for being here. Look, that's a huge challenge at the start of any major reporting project, whether it's a book or whether it's just a long-range story that you're working on, is to figure out how do you put together something that will benefit from long-range, intensive reporting and also still feel new and current and competitive when it comes out. And yes, there's the commercial pressure to attract readers who will spend money to consume it. But it's also just, look, like we have demanding day jobs, we have demanding personal and family lives. Doing a book is an extraordinarily laborious undertaking, and we didn't want to do that and then find ourselves generating something that nobody would find particularly valuable because they've heard it all before. So, look, I think you mentioned the Woodward and Costa book, you mentioned the Maggie book. We knew that Isaac Dovere was doing a campaign book. We knew there were a couple other books that were going to be more tethered to the 2020 election, and a couple other books that were going to be anchored really, really squarely in the Trump White House. And we thought, both for those competitive reasons, and also because of just wanting to say something new to readers that they really, really would not feel like was entirely familiar to them, that we just sort of camped with this idea to try to take a risk on a narrative that would span the run-up to the 2020 election, the aftermath, and the consequences of that election. And when we started talking about doing that, we didn't know that January 6th was coming. We didn't know that Trump would refuse to succeed.
Yeah. But tell that to the authorities.
Right. But what we did know was that the country was going through an extraordinary crisis in 2020 in the form of COVID, and then crisis upon crisis after that, and that it was going to be a real test of the system. Could we have a free and fair election and a transfer of power, and then a new administration that actually got some stuff done? So that was the sort of broad shape of this thing, even before you started to fill in the most alarming details of that picture.
I want to get to the story of the two parties, the two presidents, but I mentioned the narrative. The story of January 6th has been told and retold in a million different ways, but somehow it seemed fresher in this book because of the first-hand accounts that you had. And I was mentioning to J. Mart before we came out here that I found it, what's so clear in this book is just how much people in both parties really felt their lives were in danger that day. You talk about Anthony Gonzalez, who ended up voting for impeachment on a Republican, and it probably cost him his political career to do it. But on that day, talk about what he did. And on the other side, Jason Crow and the conversation that he had with his wife, a Republican, a Democrat, young, former military. Speak to that.
Sure. You know, one of the things that we pride ourselves on in the process of reporting this book was talking to so many members of Congress who are not household names, right? And really trying to animate the forces that were driving them to make excruciating decisions like ending your own political career by voting to impeach Donald Trump as a Republican, or just what's going through your head in those crucial moments. That we knew that if we generated a narrative about January 6th that told you all that Donald Trump gave this speech on the National Mall and they evacuated Mike Pence from the Senate floor, and then they all, they took the Congress to a secure location, et cetera, like that's all pretty familiar material. We knew that we had to get deeper into that, and Jonathan had the enormous advantage and dubious opportunity of actually being in the Capitol complex while the attack was going on.
Actually, I remember seeing you wandering around on the feeds from the Capitol that night.
Yeah. But Anthony Gonzalez told us this. Well, these members told us, told their colleagues, told friends and family about these really wrenching things that they did in real time. So Jason Crow is calling. Jason Crow is a Democrat elected in 2018 from Colorado, former Army Ranger. He's in the gallery when the Capitol is locked down, and he calls his wife. And she knows that he's a soldier, and she knows the kind of training he has and the way he might want to behave in that situation. And she tells him, don't be a hero. She's scared that her husband is going to try to do what he thinks is the right thing.
And she mentioned to him that he has children.
And we should add that he sent her home early.
He sent her home early. This was one of the most chilling things I think we discovered in the run-up to reporting on the run-up to January 6th, is how many members felt like something terrible was about to happen.
So ominous.
So Jason Crow, Andy Kim from New Jersey did the same thing. Their families were either going to come to Washington or were already in Washington for January 6th, and they just felt like something feels really wrong. I don't want my spouse, I don't want my daughter or son to be in this city anymore.
Yeah. And Gonzalez left a note in his desk.
So Anthony Gonzalez is a Republican from Ohio who some folks in this room might recall played pro football. He played for the Peyton Manning era Indianapolis Colts, and he entered politics, pretty young guy. He's still in his 30s. A fascinating story, a Cuban-American, and was sort of widely seen as this rising star in GOP politics in Congress. And he is really shaken by the events of that day. And we talked to him at great length about his experience that day. And it's one of the most compelling parts of the book, I think. He was in his office in the Capitol complex, and he decides to write a note for his wife and to put it in the desk just in case he lost his life. And just hearing that in the interview, it sort of gives you chills because you realize what was going through the minds of lawmakers in those hours, and just how close we were to an even greater catastrophe on January 6th. And just to finish the story on Gonzalez, he decided a few months after January 6th that he was not going to run for re-election. He's 37 years old, I think, and he had voted to impeach President Trump a week after January 6th, and obviously caught hell from President Trump because of that vote. And he talks about sort of death threats that have come in against he and his family, about being met at the airport back in Ohio with uniformed police officers to escort him off the gate. And I just don't want this life anymore. It's just not worth it. I have wife and young kids, and who needs that? And frankly, he's pretty honest about it's not even worth it to come back here for a party that is still sort of in the throes of Trumpism anyways. And so he's a fascinating character in this book, both for his experience on the 6th and then for everything that flows out of that and sort of his disillusionment with his party and with politics generally.
you have a lot of scenes from inside the Republican caucus, and we're going to talk about both parties here, but I want to talk about things that have meaning beyond the storyline of this book and into the future. There was a debate. We had a great Republican in this state named Abraham Lincoln, who
He's
said
from Illinois.
his first.
I don't think he was born here, though, David.
In his first inaugural address, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends." This is right before the Civil War. "We must not be enemies, though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection." So you have a Republican from Arizona now named Andy Biggs, and he had a slightly different message in the Republican caucus in the aftermath of January 6th, and his ire was aimed not at at Democrats certainly, but at Liz Cheney for taking on Trump. And he accused her of giving aid and comfort to Democrats. And he said, they're not just an opponent, they're an adversary that's trying to wipe this country out and change it forever.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that quote is heavy with meaning, because it is sort of it is what is driving so much of Republican politics now. We talk about Trumpism. We were just talking before we came out here about this Senate race in Pennsylvania right now. Well, Donald Trump has endorsed Dr. Oz. There's another candidate who's spent $40 million or something. And there's a woman who's going to very likely win that primary, or certainly could, who has spent virtually nothing, but is, in Steve Bannon's word, ultra MAGA, to the right of Trump and all of them. What does this say about the state of Republican politics?
You want to go first?
Well, I think the notion that...
Or is that a leading question?
I think it is, but but I think I'm willing to be led on this one. No, I think that the sentiment behind what Andy Biggs said is so pervasive in Republican politics, even among people who are actually comparatively ideologically mainstream relative to Andy Biggs, people who don't necessarily have way out there right-wing policy ideas, but who just feel like the Democrats are out to take this country apart at the building blocks. And I think when you see the other party that way, it makes the basic operations of American government virtually impossible if that gains prominence. Look, this story in Pennsylvania is extraordinary. I think that it speaks to a couple different things, but one of them is, we have written so many times, including in this book, about Trump's control of the Republican Party. This is not a study in Trump controlling the Republican Party. He's not been able to make Dr. Oz the decisive frontrunner in Pennsylvania. But Trump's brand of politics is definitely in control of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. This candidate, Kathy Barnett, she is in many ways more Trump than Trump. And she has been out there saying, this is a paraphrase, but that Trump doesn't control the MAGA movement. We're more than that. And that's actually, it's a hell of a signal about the overall trend in Republican politics. I think you could even make the case that it's a little bit ominous for Donald Trump personally. The point at which the sort of next generation of revolutionaries starts to say that the guy who led them on the Long March is not actually in control of the revolution anymore, that makes things pretty unpredictable for everybody involved.
We should point out that in the governor's race, in the governor's primary, you also have a candidate who's likely to win, who is running in tandem with the Senate candidate, or loosely in tandem, who is also far to the right of the other candidates there. And
but I think what's so telling is that we use these terms like far to the right, and I get why. But I think 10 years ago, if we were using that language about the so-called Tea Party era candidates, that would have been a shorthand for down the line ideological conservatism on issue X, Y, and Z, right? They are for limited spending. They are culture issues. I think it's so much more now based on affect and sort of pugilism now, more than it is any kind of menu of issues, David. And what's so appealing about Barnett, I think, for a lot of Republicans is not just what kind of politics she's talking about. It's the packaging too. It's her story. It's her profile of the Republican Party is now organized chiefly around opposition to and really contempt for the Democrats, and a sort of finger in the eye platform. It's basically what the platform is we are against those guys, and we want to take it to those guys. And what better way to take it to those guys than putting forth a conservative black woman who is saying a lot of the things that you believe, but saying them pretty emphatically and sort of offering her own fascinating life story that serves as kind of a rebuke to what you believe are the pieties of the left. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff. And again, it's wrapped up as much in sort of profile and image and appearance as it is any sort of set of issues.
Yeah,
and that's different from 10 years ago.
It speaks to why Governor DeSantis has become,
Trump first, then DeSantis, now this, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the through line.
But DeSantis, he comes across like the quarterback of the high school football team, slamming the geeky kid against the lockers to get laughs from the cheerleaders. Except in this case, the geeky kids are the Democrats and Democratic shibboleths. So you're looking at me like you don't like my analogy.
No, but it's the slamming against the locker that's the appeal, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the muscularity of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. How much do you think, we're sitting here, obviously you know this, in the district that spawned Barack Obama's political career. How much of this nativism, when you hear Andy Biggs' quote about they want to change America, you hear this discussion about, they want to replace us, push us out. How much of that was a reaction to the election of the first black president?
I think there's no question that it accelerated that, and it brought it into the mainstream of conservative politics here in a way that it hadn't been before. I think part of it is the actual reaction to the election of the first black president. I think part of it also is, frankly, the political success of Democrats in the 2006 and 2008 elections just wiped out a generation of mainstream, comparatively mainstream conservative politicians, and just opened the door to whoever would put their name on the ballot when the 2010 election came around. You just broke the old guard establishment of the Republican Party the old-fashioned way by defeating them at the ballot box in consecutive elections. I think that it is a bigger story than a reaction to Barack Obama, and I think the proof of that is when you look at other Western countries where this style of politics has also been on the rise, in some cases before us, and in some cases accelerating substantially after us. That right-wing populism, broadly defined, has been on the march across Central and Western and Eastern Europe and the UK for some time, and in some respects, we're like a lagging indicator of the direction of Western democratic politics culturally. But look, I think that it's obvious. Jonathan alluded to the Tea Party before. I think it's one of the things that the media has been pretty upfront about, and looking back on coverage of the Tea Party, is that yes, there were a lot of candidates who put their names on the ballot in 2010 and afterwards who sincerely believed in limited spending and small government and hated the ACA and other Obama-era policies. But were their voters really motivated by a profound ideological opposition to expanded government spending? Some of them were clearly motivated by some other and much darker stuff.
And I guess what's different now is it's kind of okay to remove the...
Right.
Yes, and that's something that Trump did.
Yeah.
He removed both sides of it, right? He removed the pretense that it's not about race and identity, and he removed the pretense that they care about spending, right? The Trump-era Republican Party doesn't give a damn about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to spend very little time on this because it's been so picked over in the coverage of your book, but it does speak to the power of this movement that we've been discussing. Both the Republican leaders in the Senate and the House, their initial reaction to Trump's, to January 6th was repugnance, it's fair to say, or at least they expressed that. In Mitch McConnell's case, it seemed to be very visceral.
Yeah.
In McCarthy's case, who knows? But they both expressed themselves to their caucuses and to their leadership on this. That very quickly in McCarthy's case, later and more subtly in McConnell's case, dissipated. And I thought one of the most telling quotes in the book was when McConnell was sort of explaining why he didn't go along with the impeachment. I think it was the impeachment movement that he said, "I didn't get to be leader by voting with 5 members of the caucus."
Yeah.
So what does that say about their future and their command of their caucuses as we move forward?
It says that they're willing to be led by their caucus rather than lead their caucus. That's the short answer. I mean, politically, it's a lot easier for Kevin McCarthy to sort of bow to what he perceives as the center of gravity in his conference than it is for him to try to push his conference to what may be a more advantageous long-term position, but obviously in the short term it's going to create political challenges for him. So he just sort of goes with the path of least resistance. And in his case, it was a pretty speedy path down to Mar-a-Lago before the end of January of 2021.
He said he was just in the neighborhood.
He was just in the neighborhood, right? He just happened to stop in at the compound of the former president in South Florida.
But what it does have is implications, Alex, for the future, because it's very likely that when you think about Gonzalez and others who are leaving, and you look at the results, for example, in West Virginia in this primary last week when 2 incumbents went up against each other and one of them lost, who had the temerity of voting for the January 6th Commission and infrastructure. The caucus is going to be more polarized and more ferocious than it is right now. So what you guys are saying is, so will McCarthy.
Look, I think that the parties are being purified, and that as the election cycles roll by, the House and Senate are more and more dug in their ideological or at least their partisan trenches. And you can just look at the Senate turnover and who's replacing Republican senators, or for that matter, who's replacing Democratic senators. Oftentimes it's Republican senators. And I think it speaks to this. And by the way, in both parties too, I mean, I think it's possible that in the next few weeks, you could have 2 of the most conservative House Democrats lose their primaries and be replaced by much more progressive House lawmakers.
Yeah, we're going to have a
Mayor
polarized. One of the interesting things in your book is Nancy Pelosi's private observations of her own caucus. Yeah. I think she said, "You couldn't give me $1 billion to be Speaker again," which does raise the question about how long she'll remain in Congress.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
No, the question we don't know is whether she meant that you couldn't give her $1 billion because she would do it for free. Right, but no, this is something that she says in I forget if it was November or December of I guess November of 2020. After it's clear that Democrats have held the House by like this margin, and she's begging and scraping for votes from across the Democratic caucus to get to 218 and become a Speaker of the House again, and she finds it this sort of like humiliating experience, right? That she's the most formidable figure in the House in my lifetime by a lot. And here she has to go hat in hand to all these freshmen or, long-serving, but in her view, irrelevant people and ask them, please let me be Speaker.
And arguably after being sort of the thin blue line during the Trump year.
Right. And nobody, I mean, there are plenty of people in the Democratic Party who will say, fine, let her do it again. And then there's like a pretty significant block of people who, they want to make her beg for it. And she, she says what she's saying is basically, this is the last time. There's nothing that could have me do what I am doing right now. Again, what she also says, David, this is almost a year later, when the left wing of the House caucus is giving her just headache after headache about trying, she's trying to get the infrastructure bill through the House. They're just killing her on it because they're so mad at Biden and so mad at Joe Manchin for not getting Build Back Better done. And she says of two of the most prominent progressives in the House, Pramila Jayapal, the head of the House Progressive Caucus, and AOC, what they're doing is they're competing to be a queen bee of the House minority, where she just feels like her own members on the left are sabotaging the party as a whole in trying to keep power.
Which speaks to the larger question, and you guys, there's so many different anecdotes here on the Democratic side that speak to the sort of atomization of the Democratic Party.
Yes. And
how difficult that is, not just for Nancy Pelosi, but for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And some of the decisions that he had to make, political decisions that he had to make to try and signify to this
unwieldy,
identity-oriented party base that he, as a 77-year-old white guy, was okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of material in the book gets at just that you have somebody in Joe Biden who is trying to forge consensus with a party that has grown unwieldy. I mean, the blessing and the curse of the Trump era for Democrats is that it's enlarged the party. It's also enlarged the party. And that creates challenges when you're trying to sort of put together majority votes for a party that spans actual socialists like AOC with conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin. Who collectively have one thing in common, which is they oppose Donald Trump. And obviously that one thing was very significant, and it's the reason why Joe Biden's president. But once you achieve that one thing, then what's next? And I think that gets to the heart of Biden trying to sort of forge consensus in the party. And you see that immediately, David, after his election. I think the chapter that you're alluding to, as he's putting together his government, and Biden is trying to sort of satisfy this divergent party that is extremely or ever more interested and sort of organized by identity. And so he's cobbling together a cabinet with potentially a GOP-held Senate that will have to confirm all of these nominees. And with that in mind, trying to also please various Democratic groups. And this is difficult. It's a real puzzle. And, you see it when he's trying to figure out, well, who should be Secretary of, for example, Health and Human Services? Well, somebody I have in mind could do it, but, the Hispanic caucus is giving my staff real grief over the sort of lack of Hispanic individuals in the cabinet. So how do we fix this? And I think that's where this really begins. You can sort of see it in the challenges of putting together a cabinet. But it's not. It doesn't end there. I mean, this
Let's
sort of
just put a pin in this.
this.
I don't know if that's the right expression, but let me
Yeah.
bore down on that,
Yeah.
because Secretary of Health and Human Services is a really significant position, but probably more so in the middle of a 100-year pandemic.
Yeah.
And yet they chose someone who had no discernible background in health.
Right.
In order to check that box, because the forces that they were contending with were so strong that they felt they needed to. And that has policy implications.
It does, and I think the way you just put it is absolutely the right way to put it. That the forces that they felt the forces that they were dealing with were really that strong, right? It's a choice on the part of Joe Biden and his advisors to say, we don't even really know Javier Becerra. Biden botches his name when he announces it. He calls him Javier Baqueria when he announces him as the nominee. The rationale for him having a health background is really, really thin. There are other finalists for that job. Gina Raimondo, the governor of Rhode Island, Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of New Mexico, who wanted the job badly, and by the way, was the former chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, who have a much more extensive executive experience and health management experience. But the CHC is sort of breathing down our necks, and so we're going to do Becerra. And to me, I'm not saying that specific choice is like the original sin of the Biden administration, because I think that's an important choice, but it's not singularly important, but it's pretty damn important in the context of a pandemic. And if you were going to signal to your own party in those early weeks after the election that you can push me around like that, and I, the incoming president of the United States, who as a 76-year-old white guy won the nomination of this party and then won the election, that I'm so scared of what folks are saying about me in the sort of identity-based caucuses of Congress and even, by the way, on Twitter, that I am going to be rushed into choosing this guy who I barely know. I think from the start, it just sends a signal across the Democratic coalition that it's open season.
And we should point out that Joe Biden actually got elected, and you guys have some of this in your book as well, underscoring some of this in your book as well, as a kind of moderate. He was the guy who stood on the platform and said, "Do I look like a socialist to you?" And
perhaps his most effective speech of the entire campaign, by the way, was that speech after the Kenosha riots when he went to Pittsburgh. It's about Labor Day of 2020, and said just that line, and they immediately put that line on TV in heavy circulation around the Midwest to kind of defang the attacks that Joe Biden was some kind of extremist. No, David, this is the great irony of the Biden administration, is that he was the least most popular candidate, frankly, on college campuses like this. Certainly on Twitter, he was somebody who was seen as not just yesterday's news because of his age, but also his whole affect, his politics, his eagerness for consensus, his affection for figures like Mitch McConnell. I remember he said something about Mike Pence, that Pence is actually a nice guy. Oh my gosh, the backlash that then candidate Biden got for saying that Mike Pence is a nice guy was enormous. Yeah. For him to sort of defeat those forces of the kind of modern left, and then once he becomes president, to sort of like consider that constituency so much as he governs is striking, because he didn't have to do that. Those were never his voters in the first place. And in fact, Biden's aides would sort of laugh and say, Twitter is not reality. This is not real. This is not even who the Democratic Party is. But they haven't practiced what they preached.
Let's talk about a couple. There's one big decision probably the biggest personnel decision that he made, which he made during the campaign, is one you guys write extensively about. And there actually is an aspect of local interest here, because one of the people who was a prime contender for vice president was our own Senator Tammy Duckworth, who, according to your reporting, got pretty far in the process and really intrigued the Biden campaign. So what happened to her, and how did this end up falling to Kamala Harris? And what was Biden's mindset in all of that? You've got great reporting on that.
Go ahead. Sure. So I think the main picture that emerges from our reporting on the vice presidential process is that it's driven by Biden and by the people closest to him, overwhelmingly by really short-term political considerations. What do we need to do to get from early August to early November without blowing this thing that it seems like we're going to win? And so they have this rubric of traits they want their running mate to have, traits they want their running mate not to have, and like nowhere in our reporting did we discern that inside that rubric in an important place was like a genuinely close relationship with Joe Biden and his complete and total confidence that they could take over the presidency and carry the torch forward for the Democratic Party in 2024 or at any time.
Well, maybe they just couldn't fit all of that in a rubric.
It's a pretty big rubric, though. That we saw some of the polling that they were considering, that the search committee was considering. They bombarded people with questions about all these potential candidates. And one of the things that inspired the search committee about Senator Duckworth was obviously her heroic life story, the diversity that she would bring to the ticket, not just in terms of her background as an Asian American politician, but as a figure from the middle of the country, as a war hero, and as somebody who grew up at times in her life in poverty. And our reporting is that Biden connected really well with her, but the lawyers had a little bit of a problem with her, and that was that she was born in Thailand to one parent who's an American citizen and one who wasn't. And they felt like on the merits, they ought to be able to win a lawsuit against her about challenging her eligibility on sort of birtherism style grounds, but that they didn't want to have to fight that lawsuit in the middle of the campaign. And
Trump would,
and of course, Trump would make it an issue. If they were running against Jeb Bush, maybe they would have gone ahead with it anyway, because but their rationale was it's only going to take one judge in one state to knock us off the ballot, maybe not just knock her off the ballot, but knock the whole Democratic ticket off the ballot in a state that we can't afford to lose. And to me,
so what made them think that Trump would make citizenship an issue?
I know it kind of can't come to, but to me that is one of the most sort of revealing aspects of this, right? Is that Joe Biden knows as well as almost anyone how pernicious birtherism is, what a force it was in Trump's rise, and in this moment he decides, it's not that we're saying he would have chosen Tammy Duckworth if not for this. I think that he and his advisors felt strongly by the time he was coming up on his decision that he really needed to choose a black woman for the ticket, and that there were reasons why it made sense to choose somebody who'd been road tested in national politics the way Kamala Harris had been, and very few other people on the short list had. But the choice to say we're going to take Tammy Duckworth out of consideration because of this attack that we think is bogus and profoundly offensive, but we're just going to practice those kinds of defensive short-term politics. I think, again, it's another case study in sort of letting your adversary win preemptively because you don't want to lose later on.
And also, I would just add, a lot of people in Biden's orbit believe Kamala Harris was always going to be the pick, that it was a fait accompli, that she just made the most sense on a lot of levels. And, yes, Biden did not have a close relationship with her. Yes, she attacked Biden fiercely during.
And apparently Jill Biden was deeply
Jill Biden
opposed.
was not a fan of her attacks, as we report in the book, during the Democratic primary. And one wondered out loud, is there nobody else that we can pick? But that makes the fact that they never really deeply grappled with what the world would look like and what her role would look like if Biden did win all the more striking. Because if you sort of know from the get-go that Kamala Harris is probably going to be the VP, and then you make her the VP pick, wouldn't at some point you consider, okay, so what are the implications for governing after Biden becomes president if he does win? And what are the implications for a soon-to-be 80-year-old incumbent president and who may not be able to run for re-election? And what does that mean for succession? Right. We just never got the sense that the Biden folks considered that. It was just so much more narrowly focused on who is the short-term pick who can help us beat Donald Trump. And I get the importance of getting Donald Trump out of the White House if you're Joe Biden's campaign. But my goodness, they just never wrestled, I don't think at all, with the day after the election. And now here we are in a situation where it's May of 2022. There's grave questions that every Democrat is asking when the cameras are not on about Joe Biden's capacity to run for president again in 2024. And if he can't, what do we do? And it's not clear to me that there's any kind of a plan for scenario B if Biden doesn't run.
Well, and and you guys did some reporting on this, and everyone's seen it. It's not as if they've made the vice president an integral part of the administration. Biden was actually in the Obama administration. He ran the Recovery Act. He was sent to Iraq to negotiate the new government there. He was sent to the Hill to negotiate. We don't see that with this vice president.
Well, and the task that she has taken, either she's not really embraced fully or struggled with.
Yeah. Well, in fairness, they gave her, they say, you want to drive, we've got a couple of cars without carburetors in the back, and you can have those.
But she didn't even try to drive the car, is the problem. I mean, you think about, for example, the voting issue. We report in the book something that was, I think, astonishing to both of us to report, but that she never once talked to Joe Manchin or Lisa Murkowski, the two most pivotal senators on the voting issue, about the voting issue. How are you sort of honchoing that issue if you don't even have a conversation with the two most important senators on the issue. It sort of speaks to what you said, David, a minute ago about not exactly making her an integral part of the administration. Why is that not happening?
Let me ask you about a couple of other things. One of you guys talked about a decision that I think looms larger now than people realized at the time, which was the decision to jump on the movement to increase the stipend in the Rescue Act from the $600 that the Congress passed in December of 2020 to the additional $1,400 or $2,000, it turns out that was not exactly the work of economists around the table trying to get to the right number, so much as Trump, who was mad about being left out of the negotiations, saying 600 is too small, I would have done 2,000. Democrats jump on that, say these two Georgia Republicans who were in a special election shortchanged people. We're for 2,000. They should have been for 2,000. And 2,000 it became.
And after the Georgia runoffs and after January 6th, when there's a meeting of Senate Democrats, Chuck Schumer, who, by the way, was not campaigning for $2,000 checks prior to Donald Trump endorsing it himself, he brings in the new senators from Georgia, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, and kind of prompts them to tell the other Senate Democrats, we made some promises and we need to keep those promises. So this goes from being this idea that President Trump throws out there in a video on Twitter one afternoon to being a campaign issue in this very, very unusual special election to like the carved in stone economic agenda of the Biden administration. And underlying it, David, it's not just that this is a sort of like a weird sequence of events that leads to this policy. It's also, it represents this larger wager that the Biden administration makes early on, which is that if you give people in distress direct cash benefits or direct government benefits of another kind, they will recognize that you have done something concrete for them and they will reward you for it. So even before you get to the issue of inflation and whether sending all that money out there helped overheat the economy, that basic bet just doesn't pan out. That we talked to members of the House who actually raised this with the Biden administration, who said they would talk to people in their districts. They got that money. They thought that it was part of like the Trump stimulus, right? That they don't see that showing up in their bank accounts and say, thank you, President Biden and the Democratic Party. So it was just, it was a sort of a policy that came about through a weird sequence of events that didn't do anything for Joe Biden politically. And I think that, as much as anything, is the real disappointment for them.
But it does. Now, the real political problem that he's facing is not that he didn't get enough credit for that, but that he is getting a lot of credit for runaway inflation. Yeah. Not all of which, by any measure, can be blamed on that one decision. But certainly when you look at other countries and our country, every country's experienced inflation, ours maybe a bit more.
And why? In part because they're fighting the last war. We heard this so many times in the spring of 2021. We're not going to make the mistake that, who, the guy who's from this neighborhood made, Barack Obama. He just, it should have been a bigger stimulus package. We're not going to do that again. We're going to get the biggest possible stimulus package here, and we're going to get this economy moving again. And so they in effect, overcorrect. In part, I think, because of economic and political impulses. But David, also, if we're being honest here, I think also because of reasons of sibling rivalry. I mean, don't tell anybody, but Barack Obama and Joe Biden have a rivalry, and they're not the closest of friends. And I think Joe Biden felt like during his time as vice president, he was not always well respected in the Obama White House, and I think he still has a grudge that he was not sort of tapped to run for the presidency in 2016, that people in Obama's orbit rallied to Hillary Clinton. And we have this scene in 2021, David, in which Biden's riding high. I mean, he says in a very sort of unguarded moment to an advisor, I don't think Barack would like one bit the coverage of me as a more transformational president than him. So you can't take the personal out of the political equation here when we're talking about Biden's economic policies in that first year as president and why he was so intent on getting the biggest possible stimulus package.
There's a microphone there, and those who have questions, please queue up behind that microphone. I want to ask one more. But if you don't queue up, I threaten right now I'll ask more. So I want to ask you guys, and I think this conversation reflects it. This book is called This Will Not Pass. It operates on a lot of different levels, but the implication of it is that we are in the throes of something, of large forces that are not going to be easily undone. So talk a bit about that, and then see if either of you can squeeze out a positive message so our audience doesn't go home deeply depressed.
Yeah, spoiler alert. There's not a happy ending at the end of This Will Not Pass, as the title may betray.
Yeah. They're already working on This Past.
Just kidding. It passed.
No. Yeah, look, I think the political fever that this country is in, I think shows no signs of abating. In fact, just the opposite. I think all signs point to more division, more disdain for the sort of political opposition, and sadly, I think the risk of more political violence that we saw on January 6th. I don't see a scenario where that becomes less likely, at least in the short term. I think the incentives now are sort of all geared towards more partisanship, and partisanship based on a contempt for the opposition. On a positive note, I think the history of the country offers the best sort of upbeat note. I mean, we've had enormous challenges in the past, and we've had crises, and we've eventually overcome them and sort of grown stronger as a country. A couple of steps back, and then we obviously take steps forward. So I think I'm sort of hardened by the long term that the American story does tend to borrow a line that Obama borrowed, eventually bend towards justice.
I'll just add really quickly, we mentioned before that in a lot of ways the U.S. has been sort of the lagging strand in the rise of the far right across the West. And I think it's possible that we're going to be the lagging strand in the fall of the far right across the West. That, if you look at, there was this moment after Trump's election when it looked like, you have these sort of like borderline fascist parties on the rise in Germany and Italy and France, and they elected a right-wing strongman in Brazil, and God knows where it's going to happen next, right? And well, the Philippines, we can have a separate conversation about that one, but whatever. Germany's just had another election. They elected a center-left chancellor, right? Italy's prime minister is basically like, Italy's Larry Summers, right? Like, these are not sort of like, except perhaps on some college campuses, not sort of like figures of the extreme right. Right, Bolsonaro looks like he's likely to lose in Brazil. I think we have a particularly rigid and slow-moving political system that doesn't sort of process electoral results, turn them into policy, and then let the voters repudiate them or embrace them quite as quickly as it happens elsewhere. So, I don't know that's like a real upbeat message, but I do think that give this system a little more time.
I think you did
well.
If
we did, Joe Biden would face a pretty tough vote of confidence right now.
Right. Yeah.
In the Parliament of the United States right now. I'm not sure he would survive that vote. Yeah. All
right, there's your upbeat. He gives us an upbeat button, and then you have to jump in and stamp all over it. Let's take the question.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the nice overview. My name is Giacomo. I'm a postdoc at the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering. I have a question about more the center-left side. So you mentioned that the Biden administration in the choice, for example, of Kamala Harris, looked at the very short-term results. My question is, do you see a political figure in the center-left or even more on the very progressive side that could sort of embrace a more long-term view of development for progressive policies and push them forward? Because I believe that's actually, at the end of the day, one of the most vivid distinctions between what progressiveness is compared to Trumpism and very sort of short-term right-wing.
Well, this is also a very active conversation in Democratic circles these days. Also, most often held when the cameras are not on, and that is who can pick up the torch. Joe Biden said himself that he was a transitional figure. Of course, now his staff wants to say that that was only one time he said that. But look, Joe Biden was an emergency candidate, effectively, right? First to stop Bernie Sanders, and then to eject Donald Trump from office. And that was the entirety, I think for a lot of voters in this country, the rationale for Joe Biden's candidacy. So again, I come back to this sort of now what? What's next? And it's not totally clear who the heir is. Look, I think if Kamala Harris, or if Joe Biden rather, does not run for re-election, obviously Kamala Harris will be a formidable candidate. Member of the administration, the sitting vice president, first black woman in history to be a national elected official.
You think she would be unopposed in the primary?
No, I was going to say I think she'll have a robust primary. I mean, I think Democrats are not going to cede the nomination to her.
Not exactly progressive,
if
though.
Biden doesn't run. Look, I think there will be, I think, an intense primary, both within the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party and certainly among the more moderate faction of Democrats. I think you'll see a number of governors give it a look. I think senators, cabinet members, perhaps mayors. I can see the governor of this state, J.B. Pritzker, being interested. I think Jared Polis in Colorado, Gavin Newsom in California, Roy Cooper in North Carolina. If Stacey Abrams wins the governorship this year, absolutely. I think would consider it. Phil Murphy in New Jersey, and the cabinet, Gina Raimondo, the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party, perhaps Mitchell Andrew. And then I think you have to consider Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They've run for president before. That's a pretty good indicator that they would consider doing it again. And certainly the same can be said for other senators like Amy Klobuchar. So I think you would have a pretty robust primary.
Yeah, the only thing I'll just add is that I think that this is the first Democratic administration in my lifetime, and I think arguably first administration period in my lifetime, where neither the president nor the vice president is seen as like a person of real deeply anchored ideological perspective, right? The Trump administration, I think, also in a different way, not deeply ideologically
Pence
anchored.
himself
But Pence wasn't like a big vision guy, but he was a guy with a pretty fixed principles, right? But when you think about like what Bill Clinton did to set the direction of the Democratic Party and what Barack Obama did to set the direction of the Democratic Party, I don't think you can look at Joe Biden or Kamala Harris and say either of them has even attempted to do that. And I think when you look back at the last primary of the party, I think you can tell there's this hunger in the Democratic Party for somebody who's going to say what on earth they're about for the future, right? I think that's a huge opportunity for somebody if Biden doesn't run.
Let me ask you a question about this. Thank you for your question. This is a parochial political question, but it's one that I think about a lot. Doesn't it matter when Biden announces his decision? Because all of the people you're talking about are not household political names in this country.
No, and celebrity is a huge driving force, obviously, in today's politics.
So if Biden says in summer of 2023, and his habit is not to make these decisions early.
I've noticed that too,
Said that.
If he says in the summer of 2023, you know what, I'm going to just devote myself to the work of the country for the rest of my term. Or it could be late summer.
I think
what does that do to all those people?
Late summer could be fast.
Yeah. I mean,
I think the second the midterms are over, like midnight of like election night this year, the clock starts ticking, and I think every day that goes by after the midterms this year, the Democratic anxiety levels are going to like spike as Trump is sort of in the wings attempting his comeback, and Democrats have uncertainty about who's going to be our standard bearer. And I think there's going to be enormous pressure on Biden to offer a decision. But David, I think you're getting something. When Joe Biden does not want to say no, he doesn't say no very quickly. And I think this is the ultimate and final no that Joe Biden would ever have to offer, sort of extinguishing his own political career. I don't think it's going to be in a huge hurry to do that if that's the decision. I think it's more likely that Biden would offer a quick decision about running for re-election than it is he would offer a quick one about not running for re-election.
And this is also why Governor Pritzker, Governor Polis are such important figures to watch. If Biden decides not to run, like Labor Day of 2023, you're going to have to get known really well, really fast, and that requires either
Having
a lot of
of money
celebrity
helps.
going in or having a lot of money.
I mean, can you imagine if we're at Labor Day 23 and Biden hasn't said what he's going to do? Oh my gosh, the Democratic Party would be on fire across this country.
Yes, I can imagine that.
Yeah, you can.
So we've got more questions here.
Ben Barker. Two-part question.
I know this fellow.
Hey,
Full disclosure, this is my cousin.
cousin alert. When you put together a book like
How
this,
could you write a book so great?
when you put together a book like this, how do you decide what to release into the news as you get it, and what you hold on to publish a cohesive, larger narrative? And do you have any additional reporting not yet reported from the lead up to the insurrection at the Capitol that could impact the January 6th committee's work?
Oh my
Good
gosh.
question.
Well, first of all, happy birthday, Ben.
Thanks.
He just turned 30. Great guy. I went to school up the road here, a different school which we shall not name in the Chicagoland area. Look, take your second question first. I think the best reporting we put in the book for obvious reasons. But we have a lot of primary source material, and we have a note to readers in the beginning of the book that sort of gets at like why we think it's important to only use quote marks. It may sound like a small thing, but like use quote marks, but when we know those were the precise words of the protagonist in the book at the moment, and so. We have obviously quite a bit of material, some of which you've heard the audio tapes of, and it's not the last of it. But I think the best material in terms of what's in those documents and those tapes you see in the book. I think on the larger question,
Have you been asked for those tapes by the?
we have not had any kind of formal, request. So I think on the larger question, pretty easy. I mean, we don't speak to the sort of sourcing in the book for obvious reasons, and it's just not something that we do. But I think, like, generally speaking, if you have like a scoop of the century in your lap and you work for a newspaper, like, you're obviously going to put it in the paper, right? But that's not really how reporting typically works. That's the Hollywood version, where you walk out your house one day and, like, in front of the front door, there's a big bow on a gift with, like, the scoop of a lifetime. It's, like, much grittier than that. It takes months and months of work of trying to, like, track down material, verify material, get access to material, and put it together. So it's not the kind of thing that, you're like sitting on necessarily, generally speaking. So
Thank you, Ben. There'll be cake for Ben in the back of the room after we're.
Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm staff here at the Computer Science Department, and I'm also in the Evening Master's Program for Public Policy here. So my question is, well, you guys are both journalists at a pretty highly credible news source or newsroom, and I was wondering your lead up to January 6th and the follow-up, how large of an impact did you think social media had in terms of fake news getting out there, and if your sources talk to that at all? And then also, on a slightly related note, do you find that major news conglomerates such as like Fox News, are they leading those stories, or are they reacting to social media?
When you say you mean, are they driving the?
Yeah, driving the narrative.
Yeah. So those are both really good and tough questions. I think on the second, just to take the second one first, I think it's very, very clear that Fox News does an enormous amount of proactive driving of warped or otherwise inaccurate information. And I think that it's one of the things that I actually dislike about the discourse on disinformation on social media is I think that in some respects it lets off the hook some really big, really well-known, very powerful institutional players that are very, very much implicated in all of this. You know, the impact of like somebody, you know, we've all seen going back to, you know, birtherism email forwards in 2008 and well before that, that like a junk information and pernicious junk spreads of its own momentum, but like it spreads a lot faster when you have the #1 cable network pushing at least some of it. The stuff that's on social media, though, goes like beyond what Fox will put on the air, and in some cases, like way beyond what Fox will put on the air. I think that, you know, neither of us is an expert on sort of social media and mapping the way that information spreads, but you know, we both know people who are, and we both know that it's a major focus of you know, elements of the January 6th investigation. So, you know, how did all of this stuff get out there, get organized? How did people get driven, I mean, motivated to go to Washington with these ideas about the election in their heads? You know, the one force that you didn't mention that I want to mention is President Trump, right? That he was using every platform available to him to trumpet this garbage about a stolen election and very specific conspiracy theories about specific counties in specific states. And you know, I don't think there's any level of control on the part of social media companies or restraint on the part of television networks that can offset the impact of the sitting president of the United States behaving that way. So I think a big test will be what if this happens again next time and it's not a sitting president saying this stuff, but like it's one of a whole bunch of different candidates in a primary saying that Iowa was rigged, which, by the way, like Iowa has given people plenty of reason to sort of question the integrity of the process. But, you know, that's sort of a meandering answer to your question. I think the answer is like all the above and then some.
Can I just ask a quick question about this? I noticed in one of the stories in the follow-up stories, Kevin McCarthy denied saying the things that you guys reported.
Yeah, I noticed that.
You guys having baited the trap. You then released the audio of him saying what he said he didn't say. And in your reporting of that, in one of your pieces, you referred to McCarthy's dishonesty.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you had a discussion about using the word dishonesty or any compunction.
No, it's a good question, given how much the Times historically does belabor those questions. In this case, there wasn't really much of a discussion at all because the facts were so black and white that he was dishonest with his denial, and he was lying. And so I think we were very comfortable saying that, and our editors were comfortable saying that.
Would that have been the case 5 years ago?
I think probably not. I think that the expectations have changed. I will say, I think that one of the things that was so revealing about McCarthy's initial denial through his spokesman was that, you know, we presented them with the comments that we were going to attribute to him, and he denied specifically having ever said he was going to call Trump to resign. And then on this other piece in the story about saying that social media companies should take down the accounts of some of his members, he gave a much more legalistic denial. He never called for the banning of specific lawmakers, right? So to me, that's a really important tell as to his intent and awareness of you know, this wasn't just some broad brush off the cuff. No, I didn't say any of that, right? He was picking and choosing what he was going to deny and how strongly.
All the more reason why it was so shocking the following day when our story was actually up, that McCarthy himself, in his own words, would put out a blistering statement that was much more of a wholesale denial of the sort Alex was talking about that he didn't do the previous night, and which obviously sort of dug his hole deeper.
You got to hear. Here's
Look at this guy
one of
here.
your colleagues.
Another inside job.
False colors.
I'm Jonathan from Greektown, longtime listener, first-time caller.
Oh my God.
No,
This is our colleague of the paper.
No, you're not supposed to say that. In past White Houses, there's always been these figures, personalities that have emerged to give the White House texture and more personality. You know, it's Stephen Miller and Trump, David Axelrod, Karl Rove. There's always been a figure that's kind of amplified the president's personality.
That's crazy about it.
And I'm wondering why you think that hasn't happened with the Biden White House, and you know, has that harmed the White House in some sense? And who do you think is? Who do you think is the David Axelrod of Joe Biden?
Oh, you're pandering.
This is honestly uncanny. We were having a conversation in the car like 3 hours ago about like what happened to the celebrity strategist, right? Like the day, like who came out of the 2020 election?
Like a cheap 10-cent cigar. They're just gone.
But no, but like who came out of 2020 as like the architect, right? Like the sort of Bush's brain character of the Biden campaign. I think some of that's about COVID, right? I think that like it was just not as visible.
Yeah.
The dramas and the ups and downs of the campaign were just not as visible. I think part of it speaks to the like really close knit and to be euphemistic about it, a very long tenured inner circle around Joe Biden, right? These are mostly people who have been.
Yeah, but I would say one thing about this. There really was someone who could have claimed a lot of that, and that was Mike Donnellan, who was basically a recluse.
I think there are a couple people in the Biden orbit. I mean, Mike Donnellan for sure, Jan O'Malley Dillon, right? Like the people who.
Yeah, well, he was more of the strategist, and she was the tactician.
Right. But I mean, like these are characters who, in a different kind of campaign, if they were more hungry for the camera themselves.
What are you? Oh no, wait a second. What are you saying?
I said a different kind of campaign, or I didn't say and, right? But yeah, this is a huge cultural shift. I do think also part of it is just like Joe Biden is so well known, and the immediacy that people feel with candidates now because of social media. I think the sort of the personalities around the court are somewhat less compelling, particularly when they're like relatively reclusive.
Let me just add one more factor too. It's the elephant in the room. Donald Trump doesn't leave much space for anything or anybody else in the political conversation. He's not president anymore. But the coverage of him I mean, it's so intense still, and I get why he might run again. He has obviously a grasp of the party that he led as president still. But I think there's just not much space for sort of much in the way of reporting generally about the Biden administration because the curiosity is still so deep about Trump and Trumpism, and it's so animating in newsrooms and, frankly, in the political culture more broadly.
I also don't think Biden, personally, the culture of the Biden thing welcomes people stepping out and, taking credit, even if they're not claiming credit for things. It's not sort of endemic to that organization. Anyway, we're a minute and 57 seconds over.
Oh.
So we better stop because this thing explodes when we're 5 minutes
Thank you, guys.
over. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.